How do we, as believers, answer those who say we follow a cruel God who murders children like in the Old Testament? I myself honestly have a hard enough time wrapping my mind around it. And I mean, I guess just for a little context to put that, I mean, the Old Testament does describe, I mean, he commands the Israelites, go into the land, go into that city and put to the sword men, women, children.
Livestock.
You have in the flood. I mean, it doesn't tell us that there were only adults alive at the time of Noah. I mean, there's some hard stuff. God says, I'm going to send Assyrians in there to after you. And whenever they come, they didn't just attack the men and women. And so, I mean, this appears to be cruel. So what do we do with that?
I would ask, I would say, why do you think God is cruel? And if they said, well, he ordered blah, blah, it's like, well, but like in the case of Noah, God didn't flood the earth because he was cruel. He flooded the earth because the people were. So we can't blame God for receiving the product of our own sin and our own choices. We can't, that'd be like blaming the judge. You go murder somebody, but you blame the judge because you got life in prison. Well, that judge is cruel. He gave that guy life in prison. Well, he got life in prison because he murdered somebody. In the flood, the earth got flooded, not because God wanted to flood the earth. The earth got flooded because of how the people were living. And it's the same with the Israelites when they went into the promised land. It's a tough thing. But God can judge how he wants to judge. And guess who he doesn't have to answer to? Anybody else. And it seems paradoxical to say it's still a good judgment. He's still a good God. But we don't know the economy of salvation, especially in the Old Testament, and how God used that to save people. We don't know that. It doesn't say that. But this isn't necessarily to justify anything. But if you go and you read about the countries that the Israelites were taking over, I mean, like the Assyrians were ripping women out of their cities by putting hooks in their bellies, especially pregnant women because they had a bigger target. They locked up people in towers and skinned them alive and put their skin around the tower and then lit their skin on fire so the people in the tower could die. It's like when you read about the people that the Israelites were taking over, you can see like this is probably a judgment of God. But we don't have the historical context enough to know that. We just read the Bible and go, oh, and we get all nervous. And then we also sort of have to grow a backbone, I think, and say, man, the judgment of God, sometimes it's a mystery, but that doesn't mean it's not good, and that doesn't mean he's evil. My son got a spanking the other day because he hit his sister. You know who he thought was evil right after that? Me. And he said so. He said, you hurt me, and I don't like you. You're mean. I was like, well, go in the corner and think about it. Right? I love him. I just don't want him hitting girls, or anyone for that matter, but especially his sister. Sometimes correction and stuff can seem hard, but that's how I would answer it. That a lot of the cruelness that we see in the Old Testament is the result of humanity's sin, and so God is just judging them based on their own action.
No. Yeah, a few things. First, note the loaded language, the false presupposition, if you will, if I can put my tongue. Murder only applies to when you're killing an innocent person. Now, look at the flood. Were they innocent? No. Were the children innocent? Yeah, I think there you could say the children are innocent. However, a few other things to consider. One, every time God brought judgment, he always allowed for grace and mercy to come. He warned the people. There was room on the ark. So when you take a parent who is not willing to listen, God's not going to force them to do something, they refuse to listen, they don't get on the ark, unfortunately, the children pay for the sins of the parents, pay for the consequences of what they're doing. In other words, it's not as if God never gave a ways out. Yes, hell's real, but so is heaven. And he sent his son down the cross to save us, to bring him to himself. First and foremost, we're not saved from hell. We're saved so we can have a relationship with God. That's just an added bonus that we don't go to hell. In other words, we're not preaching people to have fire insurance. Have a relationship with God. And by the way, that keeps you out of hell. We definitely want to get that straight. So, on top of that, even with what he was talking to, when he would send judgment on people, God, first of all, when God sends judgment, he often uses people to bring about judgment. So with the Canaanites, he sent his people to be his hand, his judge, in the form of capital punishment. But if you read later on, God also used the Babylonians to judge Israel. So it wasn't as if it was some free fall. God says, I'm going to use you as my instrument. When you look at what was going on, if I had cancer in my pinky, I can be, quote, respectful of my pinky and leave it alone, but let the cancer spread to the rest of my body, or I can cut off my pinky and save my body. Why? Because there's something wrong with this part that if I let it continue, it's going to affect everything else. When you look at Canaan, first of all, God says that he gave them 400 years to get it right. And then it says that they reached their peak evil. What kind of stuff they were doing? Historically speaking, we actually know quite a bit about them, and it will make your stomach turn. They would rape the animals. They would rape each other. They would have orgies with underage children. They would kidnap them. There was lots of sex trafficking. They had a god that they would call Molech, and it was a bronze statue with his hands held out. And as a sacrifice, they would kidnap one of the children within the area. They would put a fire under the bronze statue of the hands, let it heat up really hot, and then they would throw a child on top of it and let the child cook alive and play the drums really loud so that the parents of that child would not hear the screams of their children. That was a nation God was judging, first of all. When there's evil in the world, the non-believer says, why doesn't God stop it? When he does, they complain that he did. And I certainly hope that this person asking this question is pro-life. Because if you're going to be upset about someone murdering innocent children, let's start there, please. On top of that, there are things that God can do that we can't. If I can get a rough and ready analogy, I cannot speed, technically I can. I should not speed according to the law down the freeway, but if a cop, there's a burglary or something going on, they have the prerogative to drive 100 miles down the freeway. Now, because of their authoritative position, they can do things I cannot. In the same aspect, God has a certain type of authority that we don't. He can make certain calls that we can't. And this is why if God says to do something, I would argue it's justifiable even if I don't know the reasons. But if I were to tell Mark to do it, that's a whole different story. I don't have God's authority nor his position. On top of this, we have to take all of God's attributes into consideration when we deal with questions like this. If God is, because often the Epicurean riddle, if God is all-loving and all-powerful, why is there evil? Oftentimes a non-believer neglects to account for the fact that God is also all-knowing. Meaning, if he is all-loving and all-powerful, and yet he permits evil, then he must know something that we don't. There's something called utilitarian ethics, where you want to do something that will benefit the greater number of people. The irony about that view of ethics is that the only person in the position to carry that out would be someone who's omniscient. Oh, wait, that's God. So, there are times where I don't understand what God does. There are times I don't like what God does, but I trust that not only is he all-loving and all-powerful, he's also all-knowing. So if he allows something, he probably knows something I don't. Last thing I'll say with respect particularly to the question about children. So when you read the passage I'm assuming they're alluding to, because there are passages where it does say to kill the men, women, and children. There's a few arguments to this. One, Paul Copan addresses in his book, Is God a Moral Monster? And what he says is this is exaggerated war language, basically. I'm paraphrasing. When I say that J.J. Watt got traded to this team, and he got paid $100 million, no one's going to feel sorry for him and say, man, they're treating him like a slave. They trade him? Can you believe the language they're trading him? Like, he's a piece of property? Yeah, he's also getting paid $100 million. Not too bad. So some people would argue it's exaggerated language, like if we say, the Texans or whatever team we root for, they destroyed this team, and by the way, next week, that team they destroyed, they're playing these people. Wait a minute, I thought they were destroyed. It's exaggerated language. And then last I'll say, let's suppose this is a real deal. Let's suppose this was literal. Let's suppose this was carried out. A few things I think can be said here. One, as I reiterate, God's commandment to the Israelites refers to drive the people out of the land, not to kill them, drive them out, and whoever stays behind, it means they're staying behind because they're going to fight. And they know the rules, if you will. I've heard stories and have friends who when we were over there in the East, a friend of mine told me a story of this kid walking towards him. 10-year-old, 12-year-old kid. And he said, stop, in English. Kid didn't stop. He said, stop, in the native tongue. Didn't stop. He said, I had to do it. I had to shoot the kid in the head. And it tore me up. But when I approached him and we picked up his shirt, he had bombs strapped to him. They were in a hostile area that if you were in that area, it was not a safe zone. Everyone knew it. So if you're in the area, you're there to fight and try to kill me. So it's either you or me. When the Israelites came into this land, it was you or me. So if you stayed behind, and the other argument is this was a military base, so there weren't women and children. But if they were, I would imagine it'd be much like the situation that my friend told me when he was out in Iraq. It's a situation where it's you or me. The last thing I'll say is this. First of all, God does not owe us any years on this earth. And second, we also have to keep in mind this is not the only life. When you look at the book of Job, he says, I wish I was never born. I would argue, I'll speak for myself here, the age of accountability. I think that if children die before the age of accountability, I think they go to heaven. Now, picture this. Again, God's omniscient, all-knowing, and all-powerful, all-loving. If he takes a child, let's say they go to heaven. Let's say he doesn't. This child grows up, lives in this pagan nation, engages in idolatry, and then likely is raised to fight back against the Israelites. If that person dies, they go to hell. Even if they don't fight back and die in that pagan nation, they go to hell because they were raised as pagans or they were following false gods. God takes them as children. I call that mercy. Grace. Is that a hard pill to swallow? Yes. Glad I'm not in the judgment seat. So I reiterate, he has authority, I don't. And if there is the age of accountability, which I would argue there is, these children are in heaven in God's arms, as opposed to being allowed to live, growing up, and dying as pagans and going to hell.
So I do a lot of apologetics, kind of more focused on helping Christians work through their faith for the purpose of growing in maturity. And so when I hear this question, my brain kind of goes through a completely different process. To me, questions like this usually signify a need to, okay, God, by Christian definition, cannot be given the attribute of cruelty. What about the foundations of our faith do I need to start working through with this person again to really kind of see where did I not explain the goodness of God correctly the first time around such that this question is arising? I usually take, when I am leading guys and when I am working with people, when they have doubts and I have been the strongest intellectual influence in their faith as far as I can tell, their doubts signify to me a failure on my end to explain things properly the first time around as thoroughly as I could. And so I take it as a teaching moment. What do I need to be aware of that I can use to better teach in the future? And also, what do I need to go back through with them to make sure that they actually understand the core realities of the God that we say we believe in?
Good stuff. The one thing I will add, and this is one of those things that it is hard. There's passages in the Bible where, I mean, you just think, okay, God, I know that you love me, and I know that there's grace and forgiveness. I just don't understand what you're doing here. And it goes back to the things I said in my talk. Where does the truth about the nature of God reside? Is it something that is outside that is a objective, factual facet of reality? Or is it something that's determined inside me? Now, whenever I look at the things that I can know about God from the outside, I know he's there. I know he's sovereign. I know he's good. I know that he demonstrated his love, such amazing love, beyond all doubts, and that while I was shaking my fist in rebellion against him, cursing his name, he looked down on me and said, I love you enough that I'm going to make the ultimate sacrifice that you might be saved. So I know he's there. I know he's sovereign. I know he's good. I know he's loving. I know there's grace and mercy and forgiveness at the heart of who God is. I also know he's just. And so when I read something in the Bible that I go, I don't like the way reading that makes me feel. Okay, but the truth isn't found in my feelings. The truth is found in the character and nature of God. And there might be answers, wonderful answers, like the things that have been said here, that you can hear that and go, okay, that makes sense. I can, that satisfies me intellectually and emotionally. But even if it doesn't, I still know that God's there. He's sovereign. He's good. He's loving. He's gracious. And even if I'm unsatisfied with an answer, I know he's good and loving. So whatever else I might feel when I read a passage, his goodness and his love is not in doubt. And that's where faith and trust comes in. Where I look at a passage and I can go, God, I don't know what you're doing here. But I know you're good. And I know you're loving. And I'm going to trust in that.
Hear my cry for truth, my cry for truth, my cry for you.